Hello, and in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to set up Blender for the game engine and just the basics of getting the game engine up and running. So when you install Blender, first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and set up PyMenu add-on. So come up here to the File menu, User Preferences, Add-ons, and when you go to add-ons, type in Pi, P-I-E, and this middle one is the one you want, the one that says PyMenu Official. So you can click to activate the checkbox, and then you want to make sure you click on Save User Settings down here in the bottom left so you don't have to do that again. Then you can also come here to Themes, and there are some preset themes in the latest version of Blender that are really nice. The one that I'm using is called Science Lab, which has this nice dark, high contrast sort of look here. So that's why Blender looks very different on my screen right now. Okay, so Game Engine. The first thing you want to do is come up here to the top center, and where it says Blender Render, you want to change your engine to the Blender Game Engine. And that now changes a lot of the features over here on the right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put your mouse pointer right on this little divider line, left click and drag to the left, and that will then allow us to see all of the text and buttons without them being shortened. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to come down here. We're on the very first button here that's called the render panel. And we want to come down here, we want to come to a category called shading. And under shading, we want to turn on GLSL. And that will basically turn on a lot of the extra bells and whistles and goodies for the visuals for the game engine, lighting and things like that, reflections. Okay, so now we're going to do our first little bit of coding in the game engine. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my mouse pointer down here, and down here in the bottom window, this is the timeline, and this is used for animation, which is great, but we're not covering animation in this tutorial. I'm going to put my mouse pointer right on this little divider line right here. And when it becomes a double arrow, I'm going to left click, drag upwards, and you'll see that I'm changing the size of that window there. Okay, now I want to change this from a timeline editor to something else, what's called the logic editor. So what I'm going to do is down here in the bottom left hand corner of the timeline window, I'm going to click, and on this button here it looks like a little clock with double arrows, and I'm going to go ahead and choose the logic editor. And with the logic editor, that's where we do basically the majority of our coding. Okay, so I have a panel over here on the right that's called the Properties panel. I'm going to press the letter N, and that'll make that go away just for now. You can also scroll and zoom your window here. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that so that you can see all three. So we basically have the sensors, the controllers, and the actuators. And basically the sensors take input. They take joystick input, keyboard input, when objects are close to other objects, things like that. So they sense different things happening. Think of them as like conditions. The controller then takes that input and passes it on to the actuator. And the actuator, think of the word action, that then carries something out. So the analogy I gave in class is that the sensor are like your five senses: touch, taste, sight, hearing, smell, and then it passes it on to the brain, and then the brain then sends out instructions to the bones and muscles to actually carry out some sort of physical action. So that analogy kind of works for me. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to do a very basic little driving little cube here. So I'm going to make sure the cube is selected, so make sure you right click on the cube. You don't want to be on the lights, you don't want to be on the camera. I'm going to right click on the cube. I'm going to click on Add Sensor, and I'm going to choose Keyboard. So now there's a whole bunch of little things here, but we're just going to do the basics. Right here where it says Key, I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to choose W. So now when I press the W key, it's going to do something. I'm also going to name my logic brick, and I'm going to name it W. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on this little downward pointing triangle, and that collapses the brick or the block and lets it take up a lot less space. I'm now going to come over here and click on Add Actuator, and I'm going to add in a motion actuator. I want it to move on the positive y-axis, and that's in the direction of the green arrow here. So I'm going to come down here, and you'll see it says location and rotation, and I've got X, Y, and Z for both of those. So I want it to move on the positive y. So I'm going to type in 0.3 and hit return. And I happen to know that 0.3 works out pretty well. Okay, so now I need to activate these. So I'm going to come over here to the sensor. I'm going to left click and drag from that little black dot. I'm going to drag it over here to this little, some people call it a donut or a bagel, this little circle here. I'm now going to come over here to the motion actuator, and I'm going to click here on the word motion to rename it. And this motion actuator is my forward actuator. So it's a really good idea that you name them so that way you're organized. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out with my scroll wheel. There's my cube there. I'm going to press the letter P to play. And first things first, the cube is all white. So I don't like that. I'll show you how to fix that in a moment. But when I press W, you'll see that the cube does in fact move forward. I'll now press escape, and there we go there. Okay, so to take care of the fact that all the objects are white, I'm going to go ahead and press the letter Z. And when I press Z, this little pie menu pops up, and I'm going to choose texture. And now what happens is you'll see that the cube is lit. It's got some shading on it. And just to show you, if I right click and select the light, if I move the light, you'll see that the shading will update in real time, and I'll actually get some decent lighting there. So I'm going to go ahead and move the light over here. And now when I press P for play, the cube is lit up. And when I press W, it moves forward. And of course, as it moves away from the light, it gets darker and darker and darker. So that's pretty cool. Okay, I'm going to right click on the cube again. And now I'm going to add in some steering. And the steering is going to basically be similar to what I just did for moving forward. So I'm going to say add another sensor. It's going to be a keyboard sensor. I'm going to make the key, I'm going to use A, and that's going to be my turning left. And I'm going to name it A also so I can collapse it. I'm going to do a motion actuator just like I did for moving forward. I'm going to wire them up. I'm going to now, this is going to be rotation because I'm actually turning my character. So I want to rotate on the Z axis. And I'm just going to type in 2 for the Z axis and hit return. So it's rotating positive 2 degrees on the Z axis. And that will give me a left turn. And I'll rename it, and I'll simply just call it turn left. Always a good idea. And I'll go ahead and collapse that. Press P, and moving forward, turning left, and I can now turn, and you'll see that I can simply drive this little character around. Okay, so since I know that turning left works, I'm going to now go ahead and do turning right, and then we'll get into some basic physics, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, so this is going to be D, and I'm going to add another motion actuator. I'll wire them up. This is going to be now rotating negative 2 degrees on the Z-axis, so that way it's turning to the right. And I'll rename it. And there we go. Now I can collapse it. Press P. You always want to test it out. And you can see that I can actually go around and steer left and right, turn left and right, and I've got a little driving character here. So that works out pretty well. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift my cube up on the Z-axis. So I'm going to press G, Z, lift it up on the Z-axis. And now I want to add in some physics. Before I add in some physics, I'm going to go ahead and give my little character here some basic color. So with my cube selected, I'm going to come over here to the far right, and I'm going to click on the materials panel. It looks a little bit like a beach ball. And because this was my default cube when I started Blender, it already comes with a material. So I'm going to rename the material. Right here I'm going to click where it says material, and I'm just going to call this player and press return so it actually takes it. Now if there wasn't a material here, so for instance if I make a new object and I bring in a cone, you'll notice that there's no material. All new objects don't have new materials. And so you would click on this button here, new, and then you would call it traffic cone and press return, and now I could go ahead and make this traffic cone that I could try to drive around and have some sort of little driving game. Okay, I'm going to select my player, and the player is right here, and I'm going to come down, and to give it just a solid color, I'm going to come here to a category called diffuse, and I'm going to click on this little white rectangle here, and I'll go ahead and I'll choose whatever color I want, and I'll go ahead and choose a blue color. And for the traffic cone, I'll go ahead and choose classic orange here. Okay, so now go back to my character here. So now I'm going to give some basic physics to my player character. So with the character selected, I'm going to come up over here and I want to go to this very last panel here. It looks like a little bouncing white ball, and you can see here it's the physics panel. So right now the physics type says static, which means nothing really is going to happen, and that's why my character, you can see he's kind of floating up in the air, he's above the grid, and when I press play nothing happens. There's no gravity, there's nothing, everything's just floating up there. So if I click right here where it says static, there's a few choices here. And the two most popular for simple characters are dynamic and rigid body. So I'm going to go ahead and choose rigid body. When I do that, you'll see that a whole bunch more options become available. Now if I press play now gravity is applied and the character goes away, and that's it, game over. I'll press escape. So since gravity is here, I need to get a ground there so my character can hit something. So I'm going to press Shift C, and I'm going to get my 3D cursor back there at the center of my grid. I'm now going to do Shift A, and I'm going to add in a plane. I'm going to press S and scale up that plane so I have a really nice, pretty good size ground. That looks pretty good. And while I'm at it, I'll go back to the material panel. I'll create a new material. I'll call it ground. And I'll go to diffuse and I'll give it any color I want. We'll do a kind of a pale green. Okay, so now I'm back to the cube. I'll select the cube with my right mouse button and I'll go to the physics panel. Okay, so now if I press play, you'll see the character does in fact hit the ground. Physics are being detected, so that's kind of cool. And there we are there. Okay. So now we have, I told you rigid body and dynamic were the two kind of most common ones for simple characters. So let me show you what happens. I'm going to bring my character up a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and rotate my cube, my character, on the y-axis, so he's kind of at an angle, you can see here. So watch what happens when I press play now. So you can see he lands, and you notice if you look carefully, he actually goes through the ground plane. That's not what I want at all. That's not realistic, and it's not detecting that he's a cube or a box. And the reason for that is because of, if you come back over here to physics, down here towards the bottom there's something called collision bounds, and you have to activate this. And when you activate it, you have to then choose what boundary shape you want. And because we're using a cube, I'm going to choose box. And now when I press play, you'll see it actually hits on contact, and I can, it sort of bobbles. There are some major problems going on here though, because now as I'm pressing play and move forward, the physics are totally messed up, and I really can't drive this character around. So we got some cool physics going on, but then we lost basically control of our character here. And we'll cover that in a future tutorial. So what's the difference between rigid body and dynamic? So rigid body, you'll see when I press play, it does that little bobble and it lands. If I change it from rigid body to dynamic, when I press play, you'll see that it just lands. It doesn't actually bobble down onto the ground and tumble at all. So I would go ahead and I would probably choose right now, for this character, I'd probably choose go back to static. And that way you can drive your little character around. Now I rotated my character and I didn't want to, I didn't mean to. So how do I fix that? Well, what I can do is I can press the letter N, N for number, and you'll see over here, you'll see some information. You'll see where my character is located on the X, Y, and Z axis, and you'll see the rotation settings. I'm going to change right here where it says Y, I'm going to change that back to 0. And you can see that my character is returned back to a normal rotation. I'll press the letter N again, and that toolbar disappears. Now when I press play, you'll see that my character I can control perfectly and drive around, but I don't really have physics. So what I would do now is I would go ahead and move it down on the Z-axis, get it right down there. So it doesn't have true gravity, but now it's on the ground and it is driving around, and there we go. If I want, I can maybe click on the traffic cone and I can maybe choose rigid body for that. And I can press play and the cone actually hits. Let's see. So you can see that I can actually knock and hit the cone out of the way, so that's kind of fun. So that's the basics of physics. So have fun with it, add in some other objects and see what you can make. Play around with some of these logic bricks and see what you can make. I will see you in the next video where we, of course, take things further.